You're listening to the Forum Podcast, a production of Calvin Theological Seminary.
Welcome to the Forum Podcast. My name is Dr. Daniel Daley, and I've been on this podcast once before, but sitting on the other side of the table as a guest. So I've been asked to sit on the other side today and actually interview today's guest, which is a huge privilege for me to do so because I get to interview one of my favorite Bible scholars. Dr. Amy Peeler is joining us today. Dr. Peeler is the Kenneth T. Wessner Chair of Biblical Studies at Wheaton College and is an ordained priest at St. Mark's in the Wheaton area, right?
Exactly, yes.
It's absolutely great to have you. Wonderful to have you join us on the podcast today. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, so glad to be here. It's been a great few days at Calvin. I don't get to come all of the time, but you really have been wonderful, hospitable, welcoming me, and I'm grateful for that.
It's good that we can be welcoming because the weather probably wasn't. But again, as a person who's from the Chicagoland,
Exactly.
or currently living anyway in the
Yes.
Chicagoland area, you're quite used to it.
Yes.
So.
The snow this morning with the sunshine, it was gorgeous. I mean, this is lovely.
We have had that lately, quite a bit of sunny snowstorms.
Yes.
And it's odd, but I agree completely. It's beautiful. Although it's more beautiful when I'm sitting in my comfy chair at home with a cup of coffee or tea and reading a book. But I still enjoy getting out in it anyway. So, and you've been quite busy since you've been here, right? I mean, so you taught in one of my courses here at the seminary, Calvin Seminary, and you have been at Calvin University speaking at a conference, 3 different sessions, I think, right?
Right.
So maybe we can talk a little bit about that as we move along, but I definitely want to ask you about sort of your own career and your work and that sort of thing. So again, thank you so much for joining us, and let's just start there with background.
Yeah.
I'm interested really kind of in a 2-pronged question about your background. First, your interest in biblical studies in general, New Testament, but then Hebrews in particular. And your career certainly hasn't been limited to an interest only in Hebrews, both in writing and I'm sure in teaching. We'll talk later in the interview about a book you wrote on women and the gender of God. Well, that's the title of the book, and we can kind of get into the subject matter in a bit more detail. So you have had interests outside of Hebrews, but you really sort of cut your teeth and started on Hebrews early on, and of course still maintain a heavy interest in that with a brand new publication on Hebrews, which we'll talk about in a few moments. So yeah, just your interest in biblical studies, what led you to get into scholarship in particular, to become a professor in biblical studies, and then in Hebrews in particular, maybe what pointed you in that direction, which is, I think, quite important to ask that question because, as you've noted before, not a lot of people are jumping into the field of Hebrews studies, but you did, right? So I'm just really interested in kind of what necessitated or motivated, right, the desire to get into that.
Sure. That's a fun way of putting the question. So as I look back, and as one ages, you do kind of look back at earlier parts of your life and start to see threads that seemed very disparate and separate from one another, and how God in great grace weaves those threads together. So if I think about my high school self, I would have said I had 2 interests. I loved church, and I had healthy church. My youth pastor was amazing. I was at church all of the time. I lived there, I think, outside of my own home. And I also would have said I loved academics. I loved study. My mom is a high school teacher. I loved reading. I had done a little acting and musical theater in my younger life, kind of elementary, middle school. But as I got into high school, I realized I'm not that good, and I really like study. And so I made a rather intentional decision at a pretty young age that I'm really going to invest in my school. What I didn't realize at that time is that those 2 paths could be brought together. My parents have college degrees, but no one in our family had graduate degrees, and so that there was a world beyond college was really unknown to me. I went to a Christian college, Oklahoma Baptist University, and had a superb experience there. I often say I am who I am because of the influence of those professors and staff. And when I got there, I took some electives, took some studies in the Bible, and then realized, oh my goodness, you can do the Bible as an academic. Sign me up.
Yeah.
And I really did change my major. I had, as freshmen do and as even sophomores do, try a few different majors. As if in the fall of my junior year, I changed to biblical languages. That was the pathway at that university. And I've never looked back and really feel an incredible sense of gratitude that this thing that I discovered that I loved at 20, I get to do and have done my entire adult life. So that was the pathway of biblical studies. And I learned from my professors, you have to keep going. I was like, oh my goodness, there's more school. There's a lot more school. So then went kind of and broadened my horizons after that point. Hebrews is a book that had captured me in high school. I've told this story several times, and I share this, I think, with many young people who grew up in the church. You're reading along. I came to Hebrews, and particularly those warning passages. The one in chapter 10 really leapt off the page to me. If you sin willfully after receiving a knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins. That sounds like if you know you're not supposed to do something and you go ahead and do it, too bad for you. Like, you're out. And that really hit me. I was, again, quite interested in the church, quite spiritually sensitive as a young person. And like many, I thought, oh my goodness, I've failed God. I did something that I shouldn't have done. And that fear, I think because I had good mentors, instead of running away from God or the scriptures, I ran in. I pressed in. And maybe that's actually a good definition for this fancy word, exegesis, is to press in rather than to run away. And I wouldn't have known that word, but under their mentorship, I ask different questions. What's going on in this passage? How do we understand this in the whole of Scripture? And those exegetical exercises were quite naive and simple at that point. But that taught me in that wrestling that this book is sobering, and it is also magnificently full of grace. And that double commitment of God's holiness and God's graciousness is maybe the tether that has kept me interested in and appreciative of this book for 20 years.
The way you said that exegesis is pressing in is a fantastic way of framing it, but it also just brings me to a recollection over my own course of both. I didn't grow up in the church, but still got involved quite at a young age in my teen years. And then, of course, going on myself to academic biblical studies, and I was a pastor before I went into academia. And thinking quite about, specifically in my mind, immediately images and recollections pop into my head of times where you do notice for sort of theological expedience or whatever the reason that there are people from certain traditions who will kind of avoid certain difficult passages because it's like, well, that's not really consistent with sort of the thing I want to teach or talk about or whatever, and so they skip over things. And I think Hebrews is full of lots of different places. One of my students said to you that she had noticed that this had happened maybe with Melchizedek in Hebrews, that it's so difficult, well, as people think it is. Maybe it's not as difficult as people expect, but that there really are in Hebrews so many difficult, murky passages. So for you, instead of just being able to set it aside and say, well, I'm going to ignore that, but to press into it and to think of exegesis itself as something to press into is just a beautiful way, I think, to think about it, that we don't have to avoid or run away from the difficult passages that we come across in Scripture, but that we should really, because they're difficult maybe, we should press into them.
Yes.
So, yeah, I really appreciate the way you said that. Thinking about Hebrews itself, when you got started with Hebrews sort of in your doctoral work and that sort of thing, there was, I think you got in right before it started to get a little bit populated, the field of Hebrew studies, right? I mean, you came in at a time where very few people were doing it.
It's true.
It was being neglected way too much. And then it's really you and a few others were really at the foundation maybe of an uptick. So like when I was at the Society of Biblical Literature meetings in November, I went to a couple of the Hebrews sessions for the Hebrews unit, and they were in really small rooms because I think people expect that Hebrews need small rooms, but the rooms were packed. There were people squeezing in and standing in the back. Is there anything you would attribute that to? Like why in the last 10, 12 years has Hebrew scholarship started to get more interest than it had maybe in the 20, 30 years before that? Is there anything you could put your finger on?
It's an excellent question, and it is one that I have considered. And I wouldn't consider myself on the foundation, but rather almost the second generation. The first year that I went to SBL, which would have been 2004, I believe, and I would need to go back and check the records, but I believe it's the case that just the year before, they had reinstituted the Hebrews group. And so that's a pretty clear indication if there was not even a group that existed and then it started. So that was, I feel like the granddaddy of modern Hebrew studies is Harry Attridge. So he, Craig Kester, Gabriella Gallardini, Pamela Eisenbaum, George Guthrie, Cynthia Westphal, these people I think were the foundations. And I remember attending one of their sessions, and I don't even know at that point, I wouldn't have even been planning to write on Hebrews. I was a master's student, not yet a PhD student, so I don't even know what led me there other than God's goodness. But I do distinctly remember that the panel of discussion, I remember two things, that they were very gracious people. They were having disagreements. I think the session was on how do you arrange Hebrews, like what's the right outline, which might not sound that exciting, but people can really be invested in that. Yeah. They were very magnanimous with one another in their discussions. And I also remember seeing both Pam Eisenbaum and Gabriella Gallardini were on the panel. And I was like, oh, there's women in this group. And in some other sessions at that point at SBL, a woman might find herself as the only one in the room. And I so distinctly remember that has become an important commitment to me, the importance of representation. Yeah. I'm part of a group, Theologia, which supports women in theological education. And the tagline is, you can be what you can see. Right. And that was very much, I filed that away. Oh, I would be welcome here. And I was, henceforth. And so then maybe second generation would be myself and David Moffat, Brian Dyer, Madison Pierce. I'm sure I'm missing others, right? Yeah, right. But we're kind of friends, Jason Whitlark, and we kind of inherited the good that first generation had done by reinvigorating. Why? I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, I guess these things just kind of happen. Again, as you said, maybe just by God's grace is a good enough reason to articulate sort of the uptick, right? I mean, it doesn't always have to be a book got published or a movement began. Sometimes it can just be that there's a groundswell of interest.
The time is right.
The time is right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I want to ask you about your Hebrews commentary. It's brand new, just a few months old. And I do have a paragraph I want to read to you in a moment. Just because it's my favorite paragraph in the commentary, but part of that's probably selfish in the sense that it also intersects with some of my own interests.
That's great.
But before I read that and ask you a little bit about it, I want to ask you about the preface to the commentary, because it is, in my view, and I've read, I mean, as we all have in our field, probably hundreds, thousands of books on biblical studies, and I found your preface to be refreshingly unique. And this is why, and maybe I'll give away too much and take your answer away from you, and I hope not to do that. No. But in the preface, you had already published before, right? Right. You'd already written books. I think you're a very gifted writer, and I wouldn't just say that because you're sitting here. If I didn't think that was true, I just wouldn't mention it. I really do. Well said. Love your writing. I think you write beautiful sentences, excellently crafted paragraphs, wonderful turns of phrase. I like to read quickly, and that's why maybe some of your books are precarious for me, because I don't get to read them quickly because I keep having to put my thumb in the page and think about a single paragraph even, right? And so here is this person, Dr. Amy Peeler, wonderful writer, gifted scholar, who's writing this commentary. But in the commentary space, you have editors, and these editors have a goal, and the commentary series have an ethos that they have to sort of keep. And, by the way, your commentary on Hebrews, I'll hold it up because I think we're being videotaped as well as audio. I don't know where hopefully the camera's picking this up. So in the commentary space, that's already the case. But then in your case, you're one of the very first entrants to a whole new series.
That's correct.
N.T. Wright on Galatians, I think, had come out before you. Around the time yours came out, the Proverbs volume came out. But you're one of the first two or three of this whole series. So you're helping not only to introduce this sort of or be involved in the ethos of a commentary series, you're helping to introduce the ethos of a commentary series. So you kind of talk about this in your preface, this process, in a very refreshing way, because I think a lot of writers would have just gone through the process of having to go through editing and drafts and be a part of sort of fitting yourself into the ethos of this series, but then just not ever mentioned it to anybody. But you, in a very reflective way, write about the process at the very start of the book, that you crafted this manuscript and you're proud of it and you're happy with it and you crack it off and you send it off, and then they send it back and it's like, well, we have feedback.
Yes.
Okay, now I have to work through this feedback. You do that, you craft it, you send it off, you're happy, they send it back. Well, we still have feedback.
Yes.
So for somebody who's already a good writer to still have to go through this process, and you write about it, I think, affirmingly, right?
Oh, yes.
I mean, you're not complaining.
No,
And I think that's part of also why it was so great to read, because you're not complaining. There is this reflection, though, of being a part of, with this team of editors, shepherding this volume into existence in a way that might not be the case for other books. I mean, we all who have published have to get some feedback.
Yes.
Whether it's from peer review or our editors or whatever. But it just seems like maybe you're reflecting on it in your preface because it's a different process for the commentary than for in other writings. So I'm just wondering if you could maybe share with the readers who haven't read that preface what that was like for you, the uniqueness of the process. Did you learn anything through the process? That sort of thing. Anything you want to say about it, really. I'm just fascinated by the fact that you desired to let us know that this went on and what it was like for you.
Well, I have to give appreciation, maybe first and foremost, to a group at SBL who had a session on commentary writing. And I was invited to reflect on the process. And really, the nugget for this preface was in the delivery of that paper. And maybe sometimes for me, that's often how good writing works, is if I can present verbally, publicly, and then transform that into writing, that writing for the ear first is very beneficial. I'm really humbled by your appreciation for my writing. Also, a lot of honor is due to Ross Wagner, my dissertation advisor. If you were to see early drafts of my writing as a PhD student, you would see how much Ross taught me about writing. And there are others along the way, editors for sure. Maybe for everyone, commentaries take a long time. I've heard stories of people being 10 years late on their deadlines and things.
I just
kind
talked
of
to somebody at SBL in November who's had a contract on a commentary for a major series for about a decade.
Yes.
And he's like, when it's going to be done, I mean, it really can't take that long. Yeah.
Yes. So that's this one took quite some time. I was contracted for this in 2017. And then I went on my first sabbatical in 2018. Sabbaticals are such a gift. And I very clearly decided, now's not the time to press into the commentary. I'm going to write this monograph on Mary. And that took over my life in some beautiful ways. But all that to say, whatever skills I developed as a writer were in this very process. I wasn't a good writer and then did this. I learned how to write in this and in the book that we'll talk about in a moment. So you see maybe the excavation. If this were a tell, an archaeological tell, you might be able to see ways that I've been able to grow. And I hope that's an encouragement for people. Maybe a young person is thinking about going into academics, biblical studies, think, well, I'm not very good at writing, and that's such a big piece of what you do. You can learn as you go. Yeah. You don't have to be kind of a wonderful English prose creator. Like, that can happen as you go along. So, but the process of writing this, I do most appreciate Rob Wall, who was my editor. Stephen Fowle is the other editor, and he was great. We had conversations along the way. But it was Rob and his insistence of, you can go deeper. I reflect, he said at some point, you have the what, but not the why and the how. Press on. And that instance, he could have been the kind of editor like, oh, it's fine. That took a lot of devotion on his part, a lot of patience and willingness to teach as he made comment. And I was grateful for that. And I think it made me a better theologian, right? Yeah. I was trained in biblical studies. Again, my undergraduate was biblical languages. I was very good at the details. I knew how to parse a verb. Right. And even when I went to seminary, I struggled to think big picture, think theologically. And that's something also I've wanted to grow into. And this process very much helped that. Not just what does the page say, but what constructive theological imagination does it help us to walk into? And it really is a process.
Yeah, the process is interesting. You mentioned kind of that you would want to encourage students in particular. We have lots of students who watch and listen to this podcast, so it is an encouragement to you all that are watching, listening. A mutual friend of ours, Matt Novenson, said that to me maybe 10 or 12 years ago, that he's published 4 books now, lots of articles. He's a very good writer. But he said to me at some point that even in grad school, there was work that he did that now, he saved old papers and he looks back at them and he thinks, oh man, it's so good that this never saw the light of day, right? Like there is this process of having to grow into this.
That's right.
And then even in grad school, when you're at a point where you're doing hopefully sophisticated, elevated academic work, the writing itself is still going to be as you grow, and even maybe even after you start publishing, it goes from raw to better all the time.
Yes.
It's an interesting encouragement, a hopeful encouragement maybe to all that all of our writing can improve, does need to improve. One of the things with this, you said you found your theological voice as well as your sort of exegetical voice,
Right.
which also I think is difficult. I mean, I kind of went in the reverse. When I was doing my undergrad, I did my undergrad in both Bible and theology, but the theological side was more my interest. I was reading systematics all the time and biblical theology, but then, of course, I went into scholarship and got a minor in Greek, and then went on in my master's work and did even more Greek, 4 years of this stuff at some point, learned Hebrew, all of that. And now that I'm sort of thinking more exegetically, I find myself having to force myself to go back into that old direction. How do I think theologically about this as well? One of the other things I think is interesting about this, though, not only finding your theological voice, you sort of also talked in that preface about how the give and take in a commentary between meeting the needs of the commentary but still being Amy Peeler.
Right.
You don't want to lose yourself either in the process of having to kind of work through all of that. And I also found that just so helpful to me because, I mean, I did write a commentary, but it was my own commentary. It wasn't a part of a series, a short commentary on the Beatitudes. And so I didn't have an ethos I had to enter into. I just wrote what I wanted to write. I would love to write a commentary at some point. I'm in a position where I'm looking at what you did and thinking I'd love to do this at some point. Cool. And I just feel like maybe that's why I wanted to ask you about that preface. Because even for myself, as somebody who's now sort of published a couple of things, I read that and thought, if I ever get the chance to enter this space, I want to internalize what you've said here and learn from it, that there is this not just a value, but a benefit to us as writers to have to do. It's not, in other words, you didn't write about it like it was a hassle.
No.
For you, it wasn't like, oh, I have to get this feedback and make these changes. There was this sense where you were learning a process that's so beneficial to all of us. And I found that so helpful.
I mean, it does seem to be a picture of the body of Christ, that we really cannot do things alone. And if we're writing a theological commentary, if we're writing who is God, then our scriptures teach us that we cannot do that on our own. Just, it is impossible because our thoughts of God will always be limited and partial. We need that community around us to point out, what are you missing? How could you draw this out that you may be diminished? That is just the nature of our work. I would love to talk to like a Shakespeare scholar. Is that true for them? Could they write a commentary on A Midsummer Night's Dream by themselves? I don't know. So is that a feature just of humans and literature? Maybe, but I think it's absolutely a demand of our literature, of our texts.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there was something you said when you taught my class on Hebrews that I wanted to ask you about as well, because it fits into, I think, to a degree, both of these books I want to talk to you about today. And if we have time at the end, I want to mention one other thing that you've edited recently. But mostly I wanted to talk to you about these 2 books. You said, I was thinking a lot about this reality, and I'm going to try to lead you into this thought, but if I'm clumsy about this and you don't know where I'm going with it, I can continue to press into it until you get what I'm trying to ask. But there is this reality that you've written a lot and thought a lot about, both again with Hebrews and with, I think it really goes back to your dissertation, but also in the commentary and with the women in the gender of God. There's this reality that God is only described as Father in the Jewish scriptures very rarely. And you and I both have read Marian Mai Thompson, who has this wonderful thing in her book, Promise of the Father, where she kind of talks about how God the Father in the Jewish scriptures as a father does certain things, and that even when he's described as doing some of these things but not being called explicitly Father, that he's still being seen as chief ancestor of Israel and father and all of these things. And so that adds extra layers to that. But even then, she would admit, and others have pointed this out, that the idea that God is Father is still quite rare in the Jewish scriptures. And then as you pointed out to my class, you get to the New Testament, and it's everywhere.
Yes.
Everywhere. Almost every book in the New Testament at some point refers to God as Father. To my students in class, you presented what I thought was a fascinating theory as to why we went from still an image,
Oh,
but a
yes.
rare one, to this ubiquitous image that
Yes.
is everywhere. So if you know where I'm going with this, I'm
Sure.
wondering if you could say for our listeners, because I thought it was great, and I've written about this. I've written about God as Father, well,
Yes.
mostly in my first book, a little bit in the second. And so, but you said it in a way that I had not yet thought about it, and I wish I had before now. So, but I'll give you credit when I steal it later. So anyway, if you wouldn't mind maybe talking about why do you think the language for God as Father became so much more prolific in the New Testament texts?
Yeah, I love that question. Well put. So, and I love kind of the image of reading through Israel's scriptures and then the physicality of turning the page to Matthew.
Yeah.
And if we had a diagram of it, we'd see like kind of blips of fatherhood and then just it would skyrocket. And what changes from the last page of the Old Testament to the first page of the New, the Sunday school answer works here. It's Jesus, right? And this is a moment in which when God chooses to tabernacle among us, I'm using John's language there, comes to dwell among us, then this revelation of God's fatherhood transforms from a powerful metaphor. Right? God is like a father to us. God cares for us. God adopts Israel, chooses, elects Israel. That is amazing. But Israel was very careful not to imagine any kind of progeny from God to their king, or that God gave birth to them, even though we have the rock who bore you, right? I'm thinking immediately of these fascinating images. They were very clear not to blur the boundary between the creator and the creation, right? This is the admonition against idolatry, the admonition for the sole worship of God alone. There is, as my theological friends will say, an infinite qualitative divide between God and creation. And so that is always kept, that fatherhood image is kept in the realm of this is a way to think about God's care. That changes when we get to Matthew and Luke and John and Mark as well, although the themes in Mark are more muted than the others. When Jesus is proclaimed as Son of God, this is not like the Son of God, and I recognize that language is also evoking the Messiah and the royal promises, but I believe it is displayed with most clarity in Luke's Annunciation, when Gabriel says to Mary, the child that you will born will be called holy, will be called Son of God. This is different. This is a statement of God, the Son, proceeds from the Father. And when we see who Jesus is, and this is Hebrews 1 that we were talking about in class, the effulgence of God's glory, the imprint of God's very being, when we see Jesus, then we see who God is, not in fullness. We will always see through a mirror dimly. We can never capture the fullness of an infinite God in our finite selves, and yet we see truly that God is a father in a way that we never knew to imagine, that this is an eternal relation, a personal relation in God, now manifest to us in the person of Jesus Christ through the incarnation. So, and as we are incorporated into Christ, Hebrews 2, as we become members of God's household, we do so only by virtue of the one who sanctifies us, the eternal Son, who became a son of humanity.
Yeah, when you said it that way in class, I immediately thought of, because I'm currently writing a book on kinship language in Paul.
Yes, that's awesome.
So the second you said that in class to the students, I didn't want to bring it up in class because I wanted them to get their opportunity to ask you questions, but I knew I would be talking to you today anyway. We have in the Gospels just once where Jesus uses the formula Abba Pater, right? Abba Father.
Right.
And then Paul repeats that only twice.
Right.
But when Paul talks about it, he said it's in conjunction with adoption language.
That's right.
You've been adopted into the family of God, and you now get to cry out,
Exactly.
Abba Father.
Abba Father. Mm-hmm.
So the way that you stated it, where you kind of talked about how the language for God as Father was there already, but like you said, it was maybe this is reductionistic, but somewhat utilitarian to a point. And then Jesus is born.
Yes.
And Jesus says not only that's my father. And clearly that's a unique relationship.
Precisely.
But he still says,
Yes,
our father.
that's right.
He includes his people
That's
in
right.
that. And Paul's making this point that Jesus is the heir of all things.
Yes.
And the heir language is also in Hebrews.
Right.
And so Paul makes this point that Jesus is the heir of all things, and as the heir of all things, and your colleague Isa Macaulay has written about this in his book, Sharing the Inheritance, about how we enter into this inheritance because we are co-heirs with Christ.
Yes.
That's Paul's language in Romans 8, for example. And I just think this idea that then because we enter into this inheritance, we then cry out, Abba, Father. The way that you said it was the language for God as Father became more common in the New Testament because Jesus is the Son.
Exactly.
And we get to enter into
That's right.
being sons and daughters
That's
through Him. There was just something, the way, it was a simple way to think about it that I hadn't thought about it in quite that way. That the language becomes more prolific because Jesus himself is the true Son, and through the true Son we become children of God. And so we can run around, Abba Father is only those few times in the New Testament, but the idea that God is Father is, again, it's everywhere.
Yes.
And that leads me to my favorite paragraph in your commentary I want to read quickly, but I definitely want to then move on to your Women in the Gender of God for a few minutes as well. There's this paragraph. Well, my favorite sentence is the first sentence of the section I want to read you. And maybe it's odd for you to hear that I have a favorite sentence in your book.
That's a gift.
But I do. So this first sentence is the favorite, and then I'm going to keep going. The sentence is, in a way very different from how inheritance usually works. And again, the book I'm writing right now, I'm working on inheritance in the ancient world, and I have this long chapter on how the Greeks and the Romans thought about inheritance, and so I'm thinking a lot about inheritance. And although there is a few places, Sirach and Tobit, where we have evidence that a father can give an inheritance while still alive,
right.
for the most part, of course, a human father, has to die to give on an inheritance. And you say, in a way very different then from how inheritance usually works, meaning fathers dying. He, Jesus, was promised this inheritance not when his father died, but when he did. That's one of those moments where I had to put my finger in it and set it down for a moment and just think about death still is there.
Absolutely.
It's not that nobody dies.
Right.
It's just that the son becomes heir when the son dies.
Yes.
And then it's through his death, if we connect it to your colleague Macaulay's work, that the covenant curses have ended and all of this. And so it opens up this beautiful chance for us to then engage in this inheritance. And this connects so much to all of your work on family language and that sort of thing. So then it goes on and you say, hence, as the author will further describe the Son, it is clear that ever since all things existed, they have always belonged to him by virtue of his creating and sustaining them. And this is where you talked earlier about your exegetical side and your theological side coming together, I think. Because exegetically, it's clear that the Son dies and then is declared heir.
Right.
But theologically, it's the case that he's always it's belonged to him from the start, and he sustains it all.
Right.
So I think in this paragraph, your exegetical and theological tendencies are coming together, both of which are based in his being in inexorable relationship with God as the Son of God. In short, God appointed the eternal Son heir of all things before creation. It is also true that God the Father appointed the incarnate Son heir of all that was already his. Again, such an interesting turn of phrase. He's been appointed something that was already his before the appointment.
Yes.
Theologically, that's just so fascinating. God has promised to give to the incarnate Son what he already sustained. With the first description, the author is stating very complex dual realities about this one called Son. It is an early indication that this Son's relationship with God includes aspects of both things, eternal and things new. The Son this audience has recently heard and seen installed is the same Son who was reigning over them even before they realized it. So this dual aspect of he's already reigning but is appointed. He's already Son and then is appointed Son. He's already reigning and he's appointed heir. Hebrews is just this sort of what sounds like maybe we overuse the word paradoxical probably, but this reality of this theological and exegetical realities coming together for you. I think even in that paragraph really hit me as somebody who's interested. So again, selfishly, it's my favorite because I'm interested in the topic.
So fun.
And I've always wanted to maybe write a popular level treatment on inheritance or something, and Hebrews would be a place where one of the few places I need to put a lot more thought into inheritance, and so reading through that just was so helpful to me.
I'd love to comment if you're interested
Yeah,
in that, or if
absolutely.
listeners are kind of, oh, that sounds fascinating, I want to know more. There would be a great way to see a transformation in my own thinking from my dissertation to the writing of this commentary. And the waypoint in the middle is Bobby Jameson's work on sonship. And I give him credit there in the footnotes, but I had really emphasized in my dissertation the eternality of the Son. And I don't think that was incorrect, because I was engaging with some scholars that were moving a bit in an adoptionistic kind of, well, the Son is like an aspect of God, like wisdom or the Logos. And I was emphasizing, no, this is an eternal personal relationship. That's what sonship communicates. But I think I had gotten the balance a bit off, right? And that's often how arguments happen in scholarship, is we've gone in one direction, so you need to push hard in the other direction. And Bobby's work is so good to say the both and in really engaging with him, thinking about that helped me be more fulsome in my description of this dual sonship. Yes, it is eternal, and it is inaugurated in a messianic, installment upon the throne. Both are true. So had it not been for him, again, community, I wouldn't have been able to draw that together, I think, in a more faithful way to what Hebrews 1 is doing.
That's great when you kind of talked about resisting the urge to swing the pendulum too far in the direction, because it happens, of course, so often. Like with Sanders and Paul in Palestinian Judaism, he pointed out things that we all probably needed to hear.
Absolutely.
But there were at least some problems, and then the critique then swung way to the other side.
Right.
And then, someone, a mutual friend of ours, Michael Bird, maybe, has been somebody who's tried to sort of bring it into the middle and say, well, some of this is right, some of it's not, but let's kind of work through it with more nuance or whatever. The same thing is true maybe right now with Paul within Judaism. I think with Moffat's work in Hebrews, that there are these people who want to look and then react and then just swing that pendulum as far to the other side as we can. And I'm constantly telling my students to resist that urge. It doesn't mean somebody's not entirely wrong. They might be. But you just can't assume because it's new or something you haven't experienced that it is entirely wrong, and you have to really think well before reacting too quickly. So it's interesting to hear that even for yourself, that you had one argument, and then later, even of your own argument, had to think, can I nuance this better?
Exactly.
Can I come to a sort of more mediating position between these sorts of extremes or whatever? It's self-reflective for you to say that in a very, very refreshing way. I remember when I was at Edinburgh doing my master's work, we had this retreat, and we went off into some village north of Edinburgh, and professors and students and our families got to come, and we just wandered around in the woods for a while. And some of the professors like Helen Bond and Matt Novenson and Paul Foster and David Reimer were all there, and they had this panel where they were talking about their work, and we just all stood up and asked them questions. And one of the questions was, would any of you look at any of your earlier work and say, I would say that differently, nuance it differently, or just fully reject something I've said in the past? And it was interesting to watch them all. I don't want to use the word squirm. That's probably disrespectful to all of them because they're very thoughtful people. But to watch them all have to really stop and think, is there? Right? So for you to be able to say, oh, maybe not that you disagreed with yourself, but that you needed to nuance it differently, I think is helpful for all of us to hear that, yes, that happens.
It happens.
And having the intellectual humility to be able to look back and go, I need to say that a little bit differently or think that through differently. I think that's very helpful.
It does seem to me, and I'd love to hear if you agree with this, that those pendulum swings are necessary sometimes, right? So I'm thinking about Sanders, and my sense is his personality is quite strong. I didn't know him personally, but someone needs to say it really bold, that's not wrong. And so, if a student were to publish something and then later say, oh, I don't think that way anymore, that actually might be an important moment in the scholarly conversation for the push to go a little too far so that we can hear the corrective to the other side, and only then can you come back. And so had Sanders not said, y'all are getting Judaism wrong, we might not have heard it in the clear way that we needed to as a scholarly community. Only then can we come back. I have, being an Anglican, right, and an Anglican convert, I love the middle way, right? This is what we do. We get the middle. And then sometimes I've had to remind myself that those who have a prophetic voice, the passionate, the ones who speak more in black and white than they do in gray, they also play an important role.
Yeah.
And there might be times that we need those voices or that we need to have that voice ourselves.
I couldn't agree more. And I think that's true not just in biblical studies or whatever. I mean, it's other fields of interest. I think it's true in society at large. I mean, I think you're 100% right in that. I mean, and I've pointed this out to people in discussions all the time about all kinds of different things, that when people get upset maybe about those reactions, the tendency is to call them overreactions. And sometimes I would say, well, sometimes that's true, and we do need to find a way to think with nuance. But sometimes the overreaction is the thing, like you just said, that causes us to have to say, well, maybe this new idea is way too far. But it's pointing out that the thing we've always held is probably not quite right either.
Right.
So that's the thing that's going to kick us
Exactly.
and say,
Yeah.
okay, now how do we take the thing that's the new extreme, and the fact that it's pointing out that what we've always believed was already an extreme, maybe in the other direction, also that was incorrect.
Yes.
And then through that new extreme to say, okay, how do we get pushed maybe towards the middle a little bit?
Yeah.
And maybe the middle's the wrong word, but just towards more nuance, right?
That's
to
good.
think
That's
about it
better.
better. So, yeah, absolutely. I agree with you completely. I want to, as we have a little bit more time here, but I really want to make sure that I mention also one thing about your book, Women in the Gender of God. Again, I'm hoping I'm putting this in a place where the camera can pick it up. This also has been out a couple of years, so I'm sure you've talked about it a
22.
lot. But I still definitely wanted to ask you about it because it intersects a lot with your understanding of family language in a lot of ways.
Exactly.
The ways that we speak about God. You do talk about the God as Father thing in here a lot. I also wanted to talk to you about your very first paragraph, though, because there's something in the first paragraph that I really loved. The first paragraph of the actual introduction itself, where first of all, your first sentence is only 3 words. Yeah. It's punchy, it's to the point, it's direct. And maybe it's an example of what we just got done talking about, right? That you say something that should be obvious, but isn't obvious enough, so it needed to be said.
Right.
Where your first 3 words are God values women, period. Again, it might sound odd to some of our listeners. Why would she need to start a book with 3 words that says God values women? But your entire book points out that it needed to be said, I think. But then you go on and you talk about this very difficult problem. You say, through the study of biblical texts, experience in healthy communities, and vibrant personal faith, many know in the core of their beings that this is true, that God values women. Evidence to the contrary, however, if given honest attention, raises questions and concerns, and at times threatens even to overwhelm the affirmation. With each fresh recovery of a misogynistic statement from Christian history, with each new revelation of misconduct in the contemporary church, which unfortunately has continued even since you wrote those words, Christians may wonder why a faith that affirms the divinely created goodness of all humans has so often failed women. Not always, of course, and then this is the sentence I was so fascinated by, because then you point out this diabolical problem that needs to be addressed, and then you say, I am convinced that there is nowhere else to go where humans, women fully included, may find truly abundant life, nowhere other than this God as revealed in these texts. So you present us with this problem. It is a problem. It does need to be addressed continually. You address it in very fresh ways in this book. But you still, it's not even like you just, many writers might have left the affirmation out entirely. And even if they had it, maybe at the conclusion, you get around to saying, well, but we also can still find abundant life in this God and in these texts. Was it conscious on your part? And if so, what is it that led you to end your very first paragraph, right? You lay out this problem, and then you still, at the very beginning of the book, in the very first paragraph, wanted to say, but by the way, I want to approach this constructively and still say that it's still in this God and still in these texts that we can find abundant life. Now that that's been said, let's though spend a lot of time on this very significant problem. Why was it important to you to start with this affirmation?
I love that question. It's hard for me to go back in time to the writing of that paragraph. And I really also want to publicly express my appreciation for Carrie Newman. He worked with me on the early versions of this book. I moved over to Erdman's, and my editor there, Trevor Thompson, is fantastic. But at the beginning, it was Carrie, and I'm forever in his debt if anyone has ever worked for him, he's quite intense and really pushed me. And so it just, the words wouldn't have come had they not been for his instruction. That needs to be said. And so it was important to me to put my cards on the table that in some ways this book transgresses to the right and to the left. And here's what I mean about this, right? For some on the right, to even talk about the problem is uncomfortable, right? The scripture's good. We should just, for those on the left, the fact that I'm not walking away from Christianity is frustrating. And so it was important for me to name at the beginning, I believe there is a very deep problem, but I also believe that God, in God's self, as revealed in Jesus Christ through the power of the Spirit, is not the problem. Having now lived a life that is after this book, and that might sound dramatic and there are other things, but my life is before this and after this.
Yeah, right. It's the turning, maybe not the, but a turning point, right?
Precisely, and there are other aspects, but in my professional life, this is the before and the after. Those words now feel a bit that they were written not just by me, but for me. My experience of this book after its publication, those have become even more true.
Yeah.
No matter what has happened and what it has cost me, God has never left, and there's no other source for enduring even abundant life, joy on the other side of ashes and mourning, than Christ. And so I feel like those things were true in ways that I didn't know when I wrote them.
See, that's fascinating because, I mean, for very different reasons. I mentioned to you in a previous conversation that we had that when I came across various problems in my own studies, and the more you dig, the deeper you dig, the more problems arise that you think, oh, now another thing I have to try to solve, right? That for me, I kept thinking about Kierkegaard's image of leaping towards Jesus.
I love that.
That things get absurd, or they feel absurd, or they are absurd, the way that he talked about it. And he had very specific things that he was calling absurd, but I just kind of appropriated and adopted the image of absurdity and thought, whenever a new absurd thing comes my way, I'm going to leap.
Wow.
Right? Leap towards Jesus, and the rest will work itself out. But there is this sense, deconstruction, of course, is being talked about so much recently that you have people who have been in the church their whole lives or who come to faith or whatever, and then this deconstruction happens. And there are lots of different ways that manifests itself, and I certainly am sensitive to every individual going through these things. But to be able to state firmly at the beginning of a book where you're addressing a very significant problem and still say, before we get into all of this for the next nearly 300 pages, I do want you all to know that for me, I can say that abundance is still found in this God, and that for whatever these problems are, he's not the one we should blame for it.
Exactly. That's precisely right.
And I loved that. So the book itself, my own journey academically was ecumenical and almost bizarre. It's funny, I mentioned Matt Novenson earlier, a friend of ours, and last time I saw him, he just kind of looked at me and he thought, you've been on a weird journey the last... because I went to Edinburgh and then to Dublin. The university there wasn't a Catholic university, but it's in a very Catholic country, and then I went and actually then studied in Belgium at a Catholic university, and all of this adds ecumenical layers, layers upon layers upon layers. And one of the things I learned a lot, of course, studying with Eastern Orthodox students and scholars and Catholic students and scholars, is that we really do, those of us who have come from other backgrounds, do have our blind sides, and so do they. And so the process of being able to share with one another has been great. Mary can be one of those places.
That's right.
And so much of the heart of this book is not just about the language we use for God, but about Mary's role in this.
Yes.
And was it important to you going into the book to want to write about Mary, or was it that the topic was the language we use for God, and then Mary presented herself beautifully as a solution?
Yes.
How did you get into that, and how did sort of Mary make her way into such a, I would say, the main character aside from God himself in this book, right?
That's
so how did that come about for you?
Yeah, it's really the latter, as you described it. So going back to my dissertation, the family of God, at one's dissertation defense, they say, what do you want to do next? And this was 2011, and I said, I think fatherhood for God language is really amazing, and I've also been reading feminist theology, and I recognize there are problems, and I don't know what to do with that, and I want to figure that out. This comes out in 2022, so that's a decade plus of wrestling with that question. in the appendix of this book, I trace through every time God is called Father in the New Testament. It's boring and long, and I see it's more like encyclopedic and a nice
Right.
resource. But that's what the book was originally going to be. Just where does the New Testament talk about God as Father? How do we understand it? I'd done it in Hebrews with my dissertation. I was just going to do the whole thing. That's actually when Carrie intervened, and I kind of presented him this manuscript. And he's like, "This is a great encyclopedia, and no one wants to read this." And he was not wrong. And so in his prodding, and I had kind of been exposed to thinking about Mary through a mutual friend, Matthew Milliner, who does art of Mary. We had started kind of maybe writing together, going to teach together. And it was this like, here's this problem. How do we think about God as Father? And I was wrestling, and how are we as sons and daughters? And it was like Mary coming up the other side of the mountain, the Lord leading her to say, I'm the answer. And I, not like her, but as all good Marian art does, as she holds Jesus, her fingers are pointing to him. She is a gateway to consider her son. And that's why the image on this book is so pitch perfect. It's Mary and Jesus in the midst of the burning bush. That's not immediately apparent, but these red tendrils are the burning bush. This is its own tradition. But what it meant for me is this question: how do we name God? How do we talk about God? Hey, Exodus 3 is an important place where God reveals God's name to Moses. Smack dab in the middle of that revelation, how do we speak of an infinite and holy God? You look at Jesus. It's the incarnation. And so in the particularity of we have gendered language for God, Father, paternity, where do we think about that well? We press into the most sexualized moment in the whole of our story, the fact that God came among us through a pregnancy.
Yeah.
And it is in that moment when we realize that at this risky endeavor to tell this story, that God decided to invite a young woman to give birth to the Son of God, that account is not sexualized. And so we can see God, who is truly our Father by virtue of Jesus Christ, is also not male, not gendered, does not privilege men. And it is the story of Mary that tells us that. So she was my answer all along. And I didn't know
and
that
I think
would be
so
the case.
often we, because again, having spent a lot of time on fatherhood, and again, I'm working on kinship language in general. So father, Jesus is big brother, and adoption and inheritance and all these things. But typically when people want to try to point out the fact that God is not male,
Right.
usually it's just by pointing to what people want to call feminine images.
That's right. That's
which
right.
there is probably something fair about that to a degree, but then we start to get into trouble when we start to assume certain images are only feminine when really they aren't.
Exactly.
Right?
Exactly.
And so we're already getting into a trap when we try to do this.
I totally agree.
So for you to not approach it through these images and instead look at Mary's story and say, how does this help us to understand a little bit better about how we can view God in light of this? Such a refreshing and interesting approach. And even in maybe more Protestant circles, since you wrote this just in the last couple of years, there's more interest, I think, in Mary.
Again, I think God
I don't know
was
that I
on the
want to make you
move.
take credit for that.
No,
but,
it's not me.
right,
but
yeah.
I increasingly encounter people who say, I've also been working on this for a few years.
Yeah.
I do think the Spirit is on the move in this way. And I just happened to be one whom God said, hey, would you be a part of this?
Yeah, that's fantastic. So I wish we had more time to spend a little bit more time on the book, and I actually had other sentences I was going to read in here as well, but I want to move on because we're really short on time and mention just two more other quick things.
Sure.
Really quickly, because I have a bigger, better question maybe after this one, maybe not better question, bigger question after this one, but I do want to mention, and I wish I had a copy. I should have brought a copy.
That's fine.
You recently helped edit a book, New Testament in Color, which just came out in August. And in that, your colleague, Esau McCauley, writes the introduction, and he says in there also something quite self-reflective, like your own preface to your Hebrews commentary. He's talking about how he was frustrated about the fact that scholars like him, black scholars, that there just wasn't enough engagement with their work. And he was sitting there and thinking, I'm using the word stewing. I hope that's okay. Maybe I hope he's not offended by that word. But he was just thinking about, like, what do we do to get black voices, to get scholars to pay more attention to what we're doing, to the work we're doing. And then he stopped and thought, if somebody were to ask me about voices from Eastern Asia, would I be able to articulate the good work being done there?
Yeah.
And he stopped and realized, no,
Yeah.
does this now make me a hypocrite? I'm
Right,
stewing and then
right.
also wondering, where are my own shortcomings?
Yeah.
And so you, along with him and two others, helped
Yes.
to edit this book. And so I do have one other question I really want to get
Sure.
to, but if there's anything you want to say, to just plug it, because it is a great resource. It is a book that is full of these voices from
Right.
all over the map, who are talking about the New Testament and introducing the world to their work and to their voice. And I just think it's a great resource. So if there's anything you want to say about it.
I'm using it in my class for the first time. I was on sabbatical last semester and just had my students do their first essays. And it was powerful to see two things happening. One, realizing that there is this beauty and multivocality and spread of insights that some of them didn't know existed. And also, most of them who wrote this essay said, I actually realized it's okay for me to bring my own contribution to Scripture. So this, I believe, is how God's kingdom diversity works. As we appreciate others, that is not a muting or a diminishment of ourselves, but to realize how we're a part of the chorus too. Yeah. And so it's a big book, but I'm thrilled to see my students use it. I'm using it in preaching. It's simply like sitting around having coffee with a group of people that you don't usually get to hang out with and hearing what they think about Scripture and what God is doing in their life and their community. So nothing exactly like it exists, but we see this as a first foray into this kind of big tent way of reading Scripture, and we hope more volumes will follow. But it's a great start.
It's the hope, of course, is that the very fact that this volume exists is hopefully a sign that this kind of thing can exist.
Yes.
And if it can exist, then maybe more things like it will exist. And that's fantastic. The last question I really wanted to ask you about was this. Well, by the way, go out and pick up a copy of the book, New Testament in Color, it's called, and absolutely highly recommend people dip into it. The last thing is this. I wanted to ask you about teaching.
Yeah.
Obviously, we've been talking about your books and your writing and your scholarship, but you're also a professor and a teacher. And I was thinking recently about the dynamic of what you and I both experienced teaching in Christian institutions. I remember I was sitting and having coffee many years ago with a Bible scholar who was not a believer. And, for example, we were talking about the fact that she doesn't believe in a literal resurrection and whatnot, but she still attended church every Sunday.
Fascinating.
Led a book club at her church where they went through popular level works by biblical scholars and theologians, and I asked her why, if she doesn't believe, why she did this. And she said, well, I just think it's even if I'm not of the church, I participate in the church because I want to interpret the Bible through the church.
Wow.
Because I just think that that's sort of part of what biblical scholarship has always been and should always remain this way, even if I myself don't really see myself as sort of. And I was blown away by this whole response.
Yes.
And I remember also at SBL this last November talking to somebody who said, I really want to engage for the church's benefit, but not for its consumption. In other words, my goal is not that everybody just reads my books so that I can have a name, but that I'm doing something constructive that actually helps the church move forward through my teaching and my writing and whatever. So this idea that there are these different ways of looking at our engagement as both scholars and teachers, whether it's in the church, through the church, for the church, however that looks. Have you ever do you consciously think about what it means for you to be a teacher for the benefit of the church in that respect? And just do you have any thoughts about that? Because I've been thinking a lot about sort of, for me, sometimes you just get up and you teach because that's your job to get up and teach, but to have sort of more of a conscious approach to what this looks like for the benefit of our students and that sort of thing. Is that something that you've put thought to and as a strategy that you have in that respect?
What a lovely question. Twofold. So I am the product of Christian education. I went to Christian high school, and then, as I mentioned, a very wonderful Christian liberal arts institution, and that's where I've always taught, Indiana Wesleyan and Wheaton. And Princeton, of course, is for the church, my graduate work being there. So I, in some ways, don't know anything different, and I know that. And yet, I think these are incredibly vibrant communities. So I love that I get to go into my classroom and be my full self. In my devotional this morning, here's what God said, and let's press in. And these students, though they are on a journey of faith, and some are struggling and some are doing well, we all are all over the place. We all say, when we join this place, we're going to talk about God. We're not going to leave our faith at the door. And I think that makes it very vibrant. For me, scholarship and my faith life have never been in competition, but mutually serving one another. As I research, my soul is fed. As I'm praying, I get ideas for work. And maybe I will go through a time in which that's not true, but thus far that's been mutually beneficial. So I've always thought these precious young people to whom I get to be a part of their lives for a time, they're believers. And my number one goal is to help them catch a love for Scripture and a hunger to keep studying it so that they will be contributors to the church, to the world. God has not called me to go and serve among the homeless in India, but I have students who do that work. And I feel like, okay, I'm just the little part of the body that's equipping them well to do that. But in light of the changes of my life, after the publication of this book, that has resulted in a much more prominent role at my own church. So I've said recently and publicly, I've said, I've been kind of practicing at the church for a long time. For the last year, I've been a pastor. And so there is a newfound ways maybe I don't even quite have words for. When I go into my classroom, I'm not just kind of equipping individuals to serve their own churches, which I think is vitally important, but I, as a pastor, maybe as my fundamental identity now, whereas previously my fundamental identity was professor. Now, as a person who is in the warp and woof and the bread and butter and the mundane of the church, that's the place from which I'm teaching. And I'll yet to see what difference that makes, but there's something new.
Yeah, I mean, even just yesterday, you mentioned that you said something to the effect, I hope I'm not taking you out of context, something to the effect of that you in your mind, you feel like you're just learning to preach.
Yes.
And that caught me off guard because I thought, well, she's been doing this kind of thing for so long.
What's wrong?
So again, there's this self-reflective intellectual humility on your part to say, I feel like there's a renewed sense in which I'm just learning to do. Maybe what you meant is just learning to do this well.
I think that's correct.
Or efficiently, or for to the benefit that I hoped to have always provided in the past. I'm just now starting to figure this out.
I think I've been lecturing for 10 years, and now I'm preaching.
That's interesting.
And they're not the same thing.
Absolutely. That's helpful.
And I hope that's an encouragement.
Yeah.
I'm 44 years old, and I feel like God is doing something new in my life. And may that be an encouragement to students that God is surprising and interesting enough that your vocations, God willing, will not get boring, but there will always be chance for renewal in ways that you cannot anticipate.
Reinventing all the time, absolutely.
Yes.
Well, this was fantastic. I'm so grateful we got to do this, to sit down. I think this is going to be a huge benefit to the people that get to watch it and listen to it. I know you have to run because you have other engagements, still speaking, and I'm hopefully that even though you're very busy while you're here, it's been a fruitful time.
It is.
I know for my students, I've already had remarkable feedback. They loved having you. Awesome. And so, just thank you so much for doing it. Dr. Peeler, so happy that we got to sit down and have this discussion.
Absolutely. Thank you. Absolutely. So good to get to know you, and I look forward to many more opportunities.
I agree, 100%. Yeah, thank you so much.